going to talk about committed. And sometimes we hear this a lot from athletes, especially college athletes or high school athletes, when they decide where they're going to go to college and play whatever sport. They'll say they're committed to whatever it is, WVU, Ohio State University, whatever the sport is. But this morning when we talk about commitment, we're talking about being all in. And a lot of times people don't like to hear about commitment because it comes with responsibilities, right? And it comes with extra effort and extra work. And for example, one day there was a pig and a chicken walking down the road, okay? And the chicken looks to the pig and says, "Hey pig, I was thinking that you and I should open a restaurant." And the pig says, "Well, maybe, what would we call it?" And the chicken says, "How about ham and eggs?" And the pig thinks for a moment and says, "No thanks, because from you it just takes a contribution. But from me, it takes total commitment." Right? So this morning, we want to talk about being committed. And I know that many of you may have grown up going to church committed. Every time the church was open, you was there. That's how I grew up, going to church with my grandparents. If you was at my grandmother's house on a Wednesday evening, you went to Bible study with her. If you was there Saturday night, they had Saturday night church, and you either went with my grandma to Saturday night church. If you was a kid, there was no questions asked. You went. But if you was somebody visiting, well, she just left you at the house. She'd say, "I'll be back in a little bit. I'm going to church." And Sunday morning, there was no question about it. There's a comedian. His name is Mark Lowry. Anybody ever heard of Mark Lowry? He wrote the very famous Christmas song, "Mary, Did You Know?" And I'm sure you've probably heard that. But Mark Lowry talked about how committed his family was to church attendance. He said, "When I was a kid growing up," he said, "if the church doors were open, we were there." He said, "I don't care if the preacher was washing the windows in the church. My family showed up and sat on the back row and we watched him." They said, "We were there every time the doors were open." Okay? We're going to talk about being committed, and we're going to read a story from the book of Ruth. And we're not going to talk about all the specifics of Ruth. And it's just a few chapters. I would encourage you this week to go home and read it. Spend some time in it. But just to give you a little bit of a backdrop of what's going on here. Ruth was, Scripture says that she was of the women of Moab, which means that she was not an Israelite. Okay, and Ruth lived around the time of the Judges in the Old Testament. But what had happened is that she had married the son of an Israelite family while they were living in the land of Moab. Okay, but at some point in time, whether it was because of a plague or something that happened, something very devastating happened to the family that she had married into. At some point in time, her father-in-law died, her husband died, and her husband's only brother died as well. So Ruth had to make a decision whether she was going to stay in the land of Moab, of her people, her home, or if she was going to leave with her mother-in-law, whose name was, what was her name? Naomi. And go to a land that she had never known before, to the land of Judah, okay? And this is where we're going to pick up this morning in verse 14, where they're at the point of decision. Heartache, devastation has happened, and now they are left with deciding, what are we going to do? What kind of a decision are we going to make? So verse 14 in Ruth says this, "And they," which means Ruth and her sister-in-law and her mother-in-law are there standing and they raised their voices, and they began to weep again. And Orpah, that is her sister-in-law, that was married to Ruth's husband's brother. They both lost their husbands. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. See, Orpah decides she's going to stay in Moab, but Ruth clung to Naomi. And then she said to her, Naomi speaking to Ruth, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not plead with me to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you sleep, I will sleep. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and worse, if anything but death separates me from you." When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her about it. So they both went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had came to Bethlehem, all the city was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" But she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, but call me Mara, for the Lord has dealt very bitterly with me. And I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" See, Naomi had went through great sorrow, great loss, and she was feeling bitter. Verse 22 says, "So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest." Now, just to kind of summarize, okay, everybody has lost their husbands. Naomi is going to leave Moab and go back to Bethlehem. The name Bethlehem means house of bread. Bayit means house, okay, in Hebrew. And so they're going back to Bethlehem. Remember, Jesus was there too, right? Remember, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And just a really little teeny tiny area now. You know, when we think of cities, we think of, you know, even towns like Elkins that's, you know, big, but it was a very small village at the time, okay? And so what happens is Naomi decides to go back, and Orpah, one of the daughter-in-laws, decides she's going to stay in Moab, and Ruth decides that she has made a commitment and that she is going to stick with and stay with Naomi and go back with her to a place she's never been, and she's going to serve her God. Okay, and we're going to talk about that here for just a little while. But we're going to start filling out listening guides this morning, all right? And number one on your listening guide is that change happens, okay, in life. Life is ever changing, okay? And I'm not saying here that you have to like change, okay? Because many of us, we don't like it, right? Because we get to a place in our life where we get a good thing going on and we don't like to change, right? That's why some people get stuck generationally sometimes. You know, we get a hairdo we like and we just keep getting it like that, right? I get my hair cut the same way every time I go because I like it, right? And many of us, we have a style of clothes that we wear maybe generationally that we grew up with, and we like those, and that, you know, that's just what we're going to wear, okay? But there is a danger. Let me tell you this. Getting stuck generationally. You risk losing your voice to the next generation of people. Okay? And so, folks, things change, right? Times change. And so what happens is that and change is inevitable, is that we have to find a way to still reach people with the gospel, because that never changes, right? The message of the gospel never changes. But we find ways to reach people with the gospel, even in the midst of an ever-changing culture. Sometimes, we said change is inevitable. Sometimes change is good. Sometimes change is bad. But it happens, right? Change happens. People get sick in our fallen state, okay? And this is an ever reminder to us this morning that unless Christ returns, every one of us that are sitting here today are going to go by way of the grave. Unless Jesus returns first. It's a reality. When we go to the graveyard and we bury people at that final, we go there and it seems like an ever so final place. It's a very sombering experience that when you go to the cemetery and you realize we're all going to go this way one day. Death comes for us all, unless Jesus returns first. Life changes. Things changes. I was thinking about Lori back there. I'm going to say her name this morning. And for the first part of my ministry, first part of my life after my Christian ministry, I started going to church up here at Frank Long's. It's been many, many years ago. And I would go and I would sit up on the front row, and right next to me sat Tom Swecker, Lori's dad, and we would sit there, and he would go sing in the choir, and he would grab me and take me up there to sing in the choir with him, and have all these fond memories of those times and those days. And looking back now, it seems like when I reflect back on all the people that we went to church with at that time, 20, 25 years ago, they're all gone. The Lord's called them all home. A whole generation of people. And it seems like such different times that now we're living in as it was then. Because that generation of people, the Lord has called home. And you know, we can reflect on it and we can enjoy it and be reminded of it. But there's nothing that we can do to change it, right? As much as we would want to, and to bring some of those folks back and to enjoy the things that we enjoy. I remember just a couple weeks ago, Marion Shaw passed away, and Marion Shaw used to sit up to the front left-hand side of the church, and she sat in a chair, and everyone, and she was ever so quiet until it just a moment the Spirit of the Lord would hit her, and she would come out of that chair, and she'd get up and tear off shouting across the church. The Lord has called her home. Time marches on. Ever feel like sometimes in life that you feel like a stranger sometimes? You're like everybody, a lot of the people that I know and used to worship with, the Lord has called on home. But we could get discouraged by that. Or this morning, what we can do is that we can still trust God. Because guess what? Yes, as times have changed, God is still the same. As God has called many of our friends and loved ones home to Himself, He hasn't changed. He hasn't left us. He is still there. And so, folks, in the times we live in this ever-changing world, we must find a way to still be faithful to God, to share the good news of Jesus Christ. You see, Ruth, at one point in time, may have felt like she had the world by the tail. She was married into a family that was intact, and had a husband and a family that she was a part of. You ever felt like in your life, you ever been in a place where you felt like you had the world by the tail? And then all of a sudden, boom, life changes. Change happens and change occurred. And there was this huge loss that came, that Ruth lost her father-in-law and her brother-in-law and her husband. Now, yes, things change, but God doesn't change. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. His message never changes. And so, folks, the second point on your listening guide is this. Is yes, change happens. And sometimes it looks like things are bad, but we cannot give up. Number 2 on your listening guide is this. Is in the face of ridicule, just keep working. Keep being faithful. Yes, you may feel like giving up, and you may want to give up, but folks, we just got to keep moving forward. Have you this morning ever had anyone tell a lie about you? You ever had anybody tell a lie about you? If you've lived any amount of time, and if you tried to live right or live for the Lord, somebody's going to tell a lie about you somewhere along the way. How far can a lie go? Well, one time we had to let somebody go at the prison. They gave their keys to an inmate. Okay? And that person, we let that person go. And when that person left, they told all kinds of lies about me. They said I wouldn't let them buy medical supplies, and I was inappropriate with the people that worked there, and that I made jokes about people's age and all kinds of stuff. And I said, that's not true. You want to know how far a lie can go? It went all the way to court. I had to give a deposition, and we won there. And then guess what? It got appealed all the way to the state Supreme Court. And it went on for 4 years. You want to know how far a lie can go? It can go a long way. All right? But let me tell you this. As far as a lie can go, God's truth will always prevail. Okay? The truth will always prevail. Have you this morning in your life ever had someone make fun of you? Have you ever had someone make fun of you because of your family? We said this before. You can pick your friends, right? But you can't pick your family, right? You get born into that. You get born into your family, right? Or ever had anyone to look down on you? I've shared here before that, we grew up, we had an outhouse, and we did it, which means, another way to say it, we didn't have an inside toilet. If you wanted to take a bath, you heated up a pot of water on the stove, and you took a bath in it. Some of you shaking your head, you've been there before. Now, we had electric, but we lived way out in the middle of nowhere. Our mailbox was 2 miles from our house. And so guess what? When the electricity went off, we was the last ones to get it back on because we were the only people out there. And so there would be times where there would be a week at a time when if it was off, you knew we were going to be days without it, okay? And so we got real familiar with using a kerosene lantern at nighttime. Anybody ever use a kerosene lantern? We spent a lot of times growing up playing cards, and we're allowed to play cards at this church, okay? I'm just letting you know that. So before anybody judges me, no, I wasn't saved then, but we still play rummy and stuff, and we spent many nights up at night beside of a kerosene lantern. We just didn't have a lot. But that's okay. Ruth refused to leave Naomi. Okay? Now, you might think, well, we're living as a frame of reference. We read our culture back into the Bible. And that's not the way that we have to read and interpret the Bible. We have to understand the culture at the time that it was written. That's why it's important for us to have a cultural background study Bible or research what was going on at the time when you're studying God's Word, so that we can pull from the text the weight of the message that the writer is trying to give us. You see, you might be sitting here this morning thinking, okay, well, why didn't she just get remarried? Okay, in those days, in those times, in ancient Near Eastern culture, when someone's husband died, especially if they were older, as Naomi was. She was a generation older. There was little hope of them getting remarried, especially if they were past the age of childbearing. And so what would often happen is those women would become poor and beggars and would often starve and be forced to get by with little bits of things for the rest of their lives, or starve to death. And Ruth loved Naomi, and she didn't want that to happen to her. So when they went back to Bethlehem, Ruth went out into the fields every day and worked. Okay? She went out into the fields and worked the wheat and the barley, and she worked hard harvesting and cultivating and nurturing in the fields of a man named Boaz. And B-O-A-Z. Put that name in your head. We'll come back to it here in a little bit. And working in the field is hard work. Anybody ever worked in the field doing stuff? Go plant a field full of whatever. My dad and I, we planted a couple acres of corn by hand. Okay? Now, we didn't make the rows by hand. We cheated a little bit. He had a thing on his tractor that he drug along behind and made the rows. But we went along and dropped every single piece of that by hand and used our feet and hands and covered it all up. And we were tired. Our backs hurt, right? It's hard work. Nowadays, we have all this equipment to help us out to make it easier too. But just the other day, I was out that road out next to Gilman that goes from D&E out to the Nazarene Church out that way. It cuts across. I can't remember the name. It's a Harpertown Road, something like that. I saw a guy out there using a piece of equipment that I've only ever seen hanging in a barn somewhere. There was a guy who had a big scythe out there. Anybody know what a scythe is? He was out there, and it has a great big hook on it, looking thing, and big long handle, and a couple places to grab it here. And he was cutting a field down with a scythe while we were going through. And I said, I haven't seen anybody use those in my whole life. Saw my grandpa use one for demonstration. This guy was using it to actually cut a field out there with it. It's hard work, though. Ruth went out and she worked, and she went out day after day working, even though she would be ridiculed by the people, or mocked or scorned for her decision. But she kept moving forward. You see, this morning, you and I, today, in the face of ridicule, people may ridicule for all kinds of things, ridicule you for going to church. Let me tell you, if you think you're going to win a popularity contest by becoming a Christian, you're mistaken, okay? You're not going to win a popularity contest that way. But folks, this morning, you and I, we just got to keep moving forward. Don't quit. People can say all kinds of things about you and to you, but the truth will prevail. God's truth will always prevail. Yes, this thing's hard. Yes, sometimes Paul said that every time in Romans chapter 7, in his discourse there, he said every time he tried to do good, he said evil was there. Right there, trying to trip him up and to hold him back. In life, we are going to fight battles. We're going to go through stuff, okay? But here, I'm going to tell you how you can go through it, all right? We're going to let God fight our battles for us. I'm going to be faithful. Here's our responsibility this morning, okay? Our responsibility is to be faithful, doing what God would have us to do, and let God fight our battles for us. Noah, remember when Noah was building the ark? It took him probably 100 years to build that boat. Okay? Noah did what he felt like God was asking him to do, even when the people made fun of him and mocked him. But when the rains came tumbling down and the floodwaters came rising up, Noah and his family was saved. there's a guy by the name of Michael W. Smith, one of the first contemporary Christian artists. And he is from Canova, West Virginia. And I know a couple, we went to church in Dallas, Texas with a guy, Jim and Faye Pelfrey. And they might be probably listening to this sermon this morning. Okay, they live in Dallas, Texas. They're from Canova, West Virginia. And we got to talking about, why is his name Michael W. Smith? They said, well, their daughter went to elementary school with him, and there was 5 Michael Smiths in that class. And that's how they distinguished who he was. He was Michael W. Smith, okay? And so he has a song, and I would encourage you when you leave here this morning, Google it and listen to it. It's just a few little verses. It's kind of like that song, that little jingle we did here, and we taught everybody that Victory Is Mine jingle. The name of the song he sings is, This Is How I Fight My Battles. Or it may even be called Surrounded, okay? And it comes from Isaiah 61 verse 3, which says, For a spirit of heaviness, put on a garment of praise. So when we feel like we're being oppressed, when we feel like we're being bombarded and the walls are closing in around us, and that people are ridiculing us, what our response is when our heart gets heavy, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to worship. Michael W. Smith's song says, This is how I fight my battles. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. And it goes on and said, This is how I fight my battles. You can ask the people that work for me or work with me at the prison. When I feel like things start heading south, when things start getting tough, I usually start singing a song, and it's How Great Thou Art. And people know, if they hear me singing How Great Thou Art, they know the battle is raging, whatever it is. Because I've went and busted out in song, because I need the Lord's help, and I need to worship because my heart is heavy, because things is getting hard. Okay, and your song might be something else. But I'd encourage you to get a song in your heart. And when your heart gets heavy, when you get ridiculed, and you know that you're doing what God's asking you to do, and you just keep moving forward, you just stay committed and worship God along the way. Because, third point on your listening guide is this: God uses committed people. Okay? God uses committed people. Go ahead and go to the next slide. In Israel, there was this title, there was this thing known as a kinsman redeemer, which in Israel, there was an order of how things was supposed to go. And so culturally, biblically, if a man died and he had a wife, his brother was to take her as his wife so the family line could go on. Now, that sounds weird, right? There's some weird stuff in the Old Testament that doesn't make sense to us now. But folks, if you read all of that and think about it through, Genesis 3:15. Genesis 3:15 is where it's called the proto-evangelism, or evangelium. That means it's the first verse of evangelism, the first verse of promise of predicting Christ would come. It was this promise that there would be, that the seed of the woman, or the offspring of the woman, of Eve, somebody someday would be born that would end the curse, that would defeat Satan. That's Genesis 3:15. And so, in every generation, with every woman, with every married couple, there was this hope that what if it was this person that was going to birth the Messiah? or the Messiah was going to come through their lineage. So when you read some of these stories, especially Genesis 38, we're not going to talk about it in here this morning, but Judah and Tamar and Onan, there's a whole story in there. That story makes more sense if you read it through the lens of they were looking for the seed of the woman who was going to save mankind, who was going to take the curse upon himself. Well, you see, what happened is Ruth appeared to be in a hopeless situation because not only her husband died, but her husband's brother died, right? So, boom, he's gone too. We can never forget that God always has a plan. Amen? God is never caught off guard. God is never without a plan. There is nothing that takes him by surprise. And what happens is that Ruth was going out into the field, and she was working in the field of this man whose name was Boaz. And she didn't know that he was related to Naomi, her mother-in-law. And Boaz says this about Ruth. He says, I've been told all about you, what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you left your father and your mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people that you did not know before. He said, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you richly be rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, whose wings you have come to take refuge under. And what happens is that, long story short, Boaz takes Ruth as his wife. And she is saved from her predicament. She is saved from her hopeless situation. You see this morning, folks, that Ruth was committed. Ruth was committed to Naomi. Ruth was committed to providing and taking care of her. And folks, God saw her commitment. You see this morning, if we want God to use us, we need to get committed. Right? We need to get committed just like Ruth was committed. If we want to get God's attention, up your level of commitment. I'm going to tell you a story here that Jesus used as an illustration to his disciples. One day Jesus, in Matthew chapter 12, one day they were sitting in the temple area and Jesus was sitting. I'm just going to read it to you. Starting in Matthew chapter 12, verse 41, Jesus was sitting there in the temple area with his disciples. And verse 41, Matthew 12 says that Jesus sat down opposite of the place where the offerings were put. And he watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. And many rich people threw in large amounts. But a poor widow came in and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Now just picture this, folks. Jesus is sitting there, and he's sitting back watching all these people come up with all of their bounty, putting all of this money in the treasury. And Jesus is unimpressed and maybe even yawning a bit and nodding off, folks. What some of you do when I talk too long up here on Sunday mornings. And so what happens is Jesus is watching this, and all of a sudden there's a lady who steps up, and Jesus raises up from his chair, I believe, and it grabs his attention, and he sees her drop in these 2 small coins. Jesus had one of those whoa moments with his disciples. He wanted to say, whoa, you see all these people coming and putting in what they're putting in? Jesus calls his disciples over to himself, and he says, truly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more to this treasury than all of the others. They gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything, all that she had. You see, she put in everything, and it got Jesus' attention. of how committed she was. And here's what's important about being committed. Last point on your listening guide is this. Committed people change lives. Okay? Because of Ruth's commitment and her faithfulness, her life was changed. God saw her commitment. Ruth trusted the Lord, and God rewarded her faithfulness by not only giving her a husband. Many of you may know the rest of this story. If not, this is great. But she gained a husband in Boaz. And then guess what? She gained a son whose name was Obed. O-B-E-D. And guess what? Then Obed had a child, and so Ruth gained a grandson whose name was Jesse. And guess what? Jesse had a son which would have been Ruth's great-grandson, and his name was David, who became king over all of Israel, and who eventually, Jesus Christ himself, is in the lineage of. Do you know that Ruth is one of 5 women mentioned in the lineage of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1 as someone who Jesus, as a relative of Jesus? She was found herself in the lineage of Christ. A lady who was born in a pagan culture, who served other gods, who refused to give up on her commitment to her mother-in-law and the God that she had found since, and moved with her to a land she had never went to, and stayed steadfast and committed to what she felt like God was calling her to do. God brought her from that all the way to in the direct lineage of the one who would bear the Messiah, the one who would save the world. Ruth, because of Ruth's faithfulness, Naomi was cared for and taken care of as well. Ruth is an example of how God can change a life and take it in a new direction. Did you know that Ruth, the book of Ruth, is only one of 2 in the entire Bible that's title is a woman's name? Ruth. Anybody know the other one's name? Esther. That's the other book of the Bible that has a woman who is the main character of it. Now, many of us, we don't get committed in the service of the Lord because we think, well, they don't need me. They can do it without me, or there's not much that I can do. But that's simply not true. You are needed in the service of the Lord. You are needed at the Arbor Church. Okay? Folks, this morning, inside the walls of this church, outside the walls of this church, I want to encourage you to let your light shine at home, at work, with the people that surround you. I want you to get more involved here inside this church. Okay? There's a whole list of things back there on that back wall. We're going to have a cleaning day coming up soon. There are activities to get involved with. There's another class that we're trying to get kick-started here on Sunday mornings. But it takes us, more of us, getting committed. There are a lot of things that we want to do and that we need to do. But it takes us being committed and upping our level of commitment. You see, every Sunday morning here, there are the crowd, okay? The crowd, that's all of us here today. But inside of the crowd, there are the committed. Folks, and I want to encourage you this morning, those people who are committed, those are the shakers and the movers. Those are the people that make things happen. And folks, I'm hoping and praying that today, that this message will speak to your heart, and you will say in your heart, or to me, preacher, I'm all in. I want to do more. I want to be more committed. I'll do whatever is needed in just a little while. We're going to leave from this place, and we're going to go out to the river, okay? And my belly's rumbling a little, and we do have sandwich meat and some chips, and we're going to eat out there too, okay? But before that, we're going to baptize some folks. And those folks, this is another level of commitment. They're publicly displaying their faith for all to see. Now, we're going to go out here and we're going to baptize some folks, and we're going to get out in the river, and I'm going to ask them all to make a profession of faith. Okay? Because we believe that is necessary before you're baptized. I used to pastor a church in Colton. There was a guy named Bernard Teeter who was in Norton, and he used to come down and help me, and he'd tell everybody alongside the river, he said, now, if you ain't saved, he said, the only thing that's going to happen here today is you're going to go in the river and be a dry sinner, and you're going to come out a wet one. There's nothing going to change unless you made a profession of faith that Jesus is your Lord. And baptism is that outward showing of the inward transformation that's taken place within you. It's a testimony. So folks, this morning as we're going to go to the Lord in prayer, I hope that you will say to yourself, I'm changing my level of commitment. I want to be more committed because I want God to use me. You know what? Everybody see the new sign out here this morning? It looks nice, doesn't it? It's a testimony to everybody driving by that God is still at work, that God is still moving here at the Arbor Church. And folks, I believe we'll have new people that shows up here because of it. And we want them to keep coming back. But what that's going to take from us is being more committed and saying, Lord, I'll serve, I'll do this, I'll do that, whatever I can do to do my part so that those folks come back next Sunday. All right, let's pray. God in heaven,